Hello and welcome to the Trick Splash Swim Instructor Training. This edition is adding chemicals. The step number one when you're adding chemicals, if you've determined that your test results requires you to add chemicals, is to redo your chemical test. Be sure it's necessary to add the chemicals. Sometimes we make a mistake and it's not necessary to add the chemicals, and especially when your test results require you to add a large amount of chemicals, significant amount, that can pose a health hazard if you're not absolutely sure you're adding the proper amount of chemicals to the pool, or if you need to add them at all. So step number one is to redo the test before you proceed to adding chemicals. If your second test result comes up drastically different from your first test result, then you need to do a third test. If your third test doesn't agree with either of your first two tests, you need to consult someone else to help figure out why it is you're not getting consistent test results. Those are important steps to do to be sure that we're all on the right track and we are keeping the pool in balance properly. After you've determined that your test results are correct and that you do indeed need to add chemicals, be sure that you're referring to the pool data sheets in the log of operations. There are several sheets, one of which helps you decide how much chemicals to add. Another lets you know the target that what it is you're trying to bring the reading up to. So you're going to refer to the data sheets in the log of operations to determine which chemical to add and what amount. And then you fill out a chemical adjustment report if necessary. We're going to let you know when it's necessary to fill out a chemical adjustment report in the reports section. However, I'll briefly go over that with you. You fill out a chemical adjustment report anytime that the level of water balance or chemical levels in the water would require you to suspend swim lessons. So if you would not be allowed to let people in the pool, or if there were people in the pool, you'd be required to get them out. That's when you would be required to fill out a chemical adjustment report, and those reports are found in the log of operations. After using the data sheets to determine the amount of chemical necessary, be sure that you double check your calculations. Once you've determined the amount of change you need in the pool chemical level, for instance, if you're using chlorine and you're measuring in parts per million, once you determine what your current part per million are, once the target and the target part per million, and you figure out the difference between the two, then you've determined the amount of change you need by parts per million. That's important. After that, you need to determine how much chemical is going to create that change in parts per million. Be sure that you're doing your calculations correctly. There are also guidelines for those in the log of operations. Be sure if you have questions to ask them in advance of adding the chemical. Once you've double checked your calculations and you're sure you're doing the right thing, be sure that you get before you use any chemical, that you've read the SDS, that's the safety data sheets for the chemical you'll be adding. Be sure that you read especially the parts about the cautions, being sure to know if you've been overexposed to a chemical and what sorts of safety precautions to take. Be sure also that you're reading the directions on the labeling of the chemical. After determining the amount of chemical you're going to add, and you know that you're familiar with your chemical that you're adding, that you have the correct chemical, you've read the labels and the safety data sheets on that chemical, you have your safety equipment prepared and you're wearing it, be sure that you wear the proper safety equipment. In a nutshell, for all the chemicals that we're adding, whether it's chlorine, pool acid, the calcium hardness plus, or the baking soda, the sodium bicarbonate, regardless of the chemical you're adding, you're going to use goggles and gloves for each chemical. That's very important. What I like to make sure to emphasize with everyone is, regardless of the tenure you expect to have at this company, let's say you expect to work here 12 years, The bottom line is that you're probably expecting to have hands or eyes much longer than that, and because of that, you wear gloves and goggles regardless of how much or little chemical you're adding, and you do that every time. When you are adding chemicals by hand, it's important to know that where you add chemicals and how you add the chemicals it is specified by the chemical that you're adding. So when you're adding chemicals, though, all of them have a general pattern of starting in the corner that has the pool hose wound up that we use for hosing the deck, and the reason for that is the circulation of the pool runs counterclockwise, and so if you start adding chems in that side and work your way against the current, then when you return to the zone, the chemical has circulated and you start again adding chems again. The other thing to remember is that you never add chemicals close to the edge of the pool. The chemicals can get on the plaster or run down the plaster once they enter the pool, and that can cause etching and other plaster damage to the pool. So you always want the chemicals, whether they're liquid or powder, to be added at least a foot to a foot and a half away from the edge of the pool. And those are precautions that you want to make sure that you take when adding chemicals. So when you're adding liquid chemicals like pool acid or chlorine, it's important to stay low to the pool. If you add from a height, the splatter will come up, and what splatters out is mostly the concentrated chemical. So if you're low to the pool when you're adding the chemicals, then it's less likely there's going to be any sideways splatter. The splatter can ruin your clothes or shoes. So be extra cautious about that so that you're not getting bleach spots on your clothes or shoes when you're adding chlorine, and the acid can actually eat a hole right through most material. So it's important to be low when you're adding liquid chemicals. When you're adding calcium hardness, you use the scoop that's located in the container, or you can use the dispenser container itself, but you want to broadcast that chemical. So you don't want to just pour it in one spot. You want to sprinkle it over a large area. Ideally, you would broadcast it across the whole pool, but if you're short on time, you can sprinkle it over a wider area. Just be sure that you're not sprinkling it onto the deck. If you do, it needs to be rinsed off the deck before you host customers in the pool area. In fact, if you spill any chemical on the deck, you want to be sure that you're rinsing it off the deck before allowing patrons in the pool area, because they are barefoot and we don't want their skin to come in contact with the concentrated chemical. What a broadcast is when you fling out the chemical like you're feeding fish with it. It goes over a wide area. The sprinkling should also be over a wide area, but it's not quite as effective at distributing it. If after adding powdered chemicals you notice that there are clumps of it settling to the bottom, which ideally there shouldn't be using the correct adding methods, but if there happen to be because the chemical is clumped or something like that, then get a pool brush and sweep the chemical toward the drain. As it sweeps toward the drain, the more water circulates past it and helps with it to get dissolved and distributed in the pool. Once you've double checked your calculations and you have in fact determined that you will have to add chemicals and the amount of change needed, the next step is to determine how you're going to add the chemicals. One convenient way that we have set up to add some of our most dangerous chemicals is by using a timer switch instead of actually adding the chemicals by hand. So the first thing we're going to cover is how to use the timer switch, and then we'll explain to you how to add chemicals by hand in the segments following. If you're going to add chemicals via the timer switch, the first thing that you're going to need to do is consult your chart in the log of operations. That helps you determine, based upon the parts per million increase that you're going to need for either increasing in parts per million for chlorine, or the increase in the amount of acid you need based upon the acid demand test. And so when you do the parts per million of chlorine and you've determined you need to elevate it by a certain amount, you look at the reference chart, look at the amount of parts per million that you're going to need to increase it by, and then you change that. That's what you set the timer for in the pump house. The pump house is located outside the pool room, and the combination is stored in the log of operations in the front leaf. Once you open the pump house, you'll find the manual control timers in the pump house to the right. Once you open the pump house timer cover box, the manual control cover timer box, inside there's also a cheat sheet there in case you forget to double check that in the log of operations. Each mark on the timer is going to be a half a minute, so it's 30 seconds. So you're going to make sure that you change, put the setting to the nearest half minute, rounding up when needed. Also, when you set the timers, be sure that you're using the appropriate timer. The acid timer dial is colored red so that you can distinguish it from the chlorine timer dial, which is white. When you set the timers, you're going to push the dial, turn the dial all the way until it is matched up with the amount of time that you want to add, and once you let go, you'll notice the spring sort of moves it a little bit. That's okay, because it's not needed for the spring to be at the setting that you pushed it to in order for it to be fairly accurate. After you do that, then you close up the box, and an important step then is to go ahead and make sure to double check sometime later that timer switch hasn't failed in the on position, so that you can be sure that it's not continuously feeding when it's not supposed to. So it's a good idea to check up on your timer, maybe set a timer on your cell phone to come back and check after you're sure that feed time should have elapsed, to be sure that we don't have a mechanical error in our timer switch, because they are mechanical timers. They will eventually fail. We're hoping they live in the life that they do, but you have to double check that your timer has gone to zero and is no longer feeding chemicals after the expired time. Those are a really great way to isolate you from having to add chemicals by hand. Now, on the other hand, sometimes there are times when there is you have to add a high amount of chlorine or and less often pool acid, and so using the timer would not be practical. For instances, in times of when we have an AFR, we need to superchlorinate. Those are the times that you'll need to add by hand, and so the following segments go over how to add chlorine by hand as well. So when you're adding baking soda by hand, you're going to find the buckets in the chemical storage shed. The containers will be located as alkalinity up, and that's what you use to change the alkalinity in the upward direction. So if your test results indicate that your alkalinity needs to increase in the pool, you're going to find the alkalinity up containers. You're going to, and likely you're going to find in the pool shed the transfer containers, and they're labeled alkalinity up and also baking soda. They have the pound markings on the side, so there's no need to weigh out your measurement since we're adding the chemicals based on a per pound measurement. So if you find the transfer containers filled with the amount you need, you can use the transfer container and replace it to the place that you found it. If the transfer container does not contain baking soda or the alkalinity up, you're going to open the bucket. You'll find in there a scoop that's labeled alkalinity or baking soda. You fill up your transfer container to the required measurement indicator. Then be sure that you close the bucket before you return to the pool room with your chemical. You'll make sure that your transfer container is also closed securely with the lid on tight so that you don't accidentally add too much in one spot. Be sure that the pump house door is closed when you return to the pool room so that you're not allowing any students to enter that area without someone else being present. And it may not be necessary to put the lock through the latch because most kids won't be able to reach the lock, but it is a good idea at least to slide the lock through the latch hole rather than secure it. Once you return to the pool room, you're going to sprinkle the baking soda or the alkalinity up powder in using the same pattern where you start at the pump house. At the hose end of the pool, and you sprinkle it out, making sure you're some distance out in the pool, not right up against the side. And then you add about 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds per pass. The reason you want to do that is because the pool chemistry is a large volume of water, so you're adding the chemical for that large volume. If you add the large amount of chemical in a small area of the pool, it's a different kind of chemistry than making sure that it's mixed in as you go. So if you add it in too concentrated of a form, it could precipitate, which means it forms a solid out of the water and it combines, and then it's undissolvable. It becomes a solid in the pool rather than a dissolved part of the solution of the pool. So it is very important to make sure that you're adding the chemicals an increment at a time, a defined increment, and that's between 1.5 and 2 pounds. When adding Hardness Plus or increasing the calcium, when you're adding the calcium chlorinate, it's important to remember that the transfer container that's labeled Hardness Plus is a single use at a time. In other words, it's not a storage container. You only use the transfer container for the Hardness Plus to carry the amount you're going to add that time to the pool, and then you rinse that container, because if you leave the Hardness Plus chemical in the container, it attracts moisture and then also dirt, which will be getting put into the pool. Also, if you leave an amount of chemical in the container, it will attract moisture and harden to a clump, which would be unusable. So it is important to measure just the amount you're going to need when doing the Hardness Plus into the transfer container. You broadcast it as specified when you're adding the Hardness Plus chemical, and then be sure that you rinse the container. It's okay to rinse it right in the pool after you use it, and then return that container over near the buckets in the pump house with the Hardness Plus buckets at that point. If any chemical clumps at the bottom, please use the brush, the pool brush, to sweep the chemicals, and you go around the pool sweeping toward the drain as you go. After adding chemicals, return any transfer containers to their proper place. Remember, you're going to rinse out the Hardness Plus container, the sodium bicarbonate, in other words the baking soda or alkalinity up container, can be a storage container. It has the transfer tag on there. That container can be stored with an amount of baking soda in it. Please return it to the correct location, which is by the buckets that are labeled with the same label as the transfer containers. And make sure that it goes back in the pump house. If you have time, it's convenient to replenish the supply in your alkalinity up container, your sodium bicarbonate, your baking soda. Use the scoop that's inside the alkalinity up bucket to refill it. If you use any adding by hand utensils for chlorine or anything like that, be sure that you're rinsing those out. You shouldn't store the measuring cup with any amounts of pool acid or chlorine in them. That can be a hazard to the next person who is assuming that those things are clean. Be sure, if you are the next person using any of those utensils, don't assume they're clean, and don't assume that the small amount of what looks like water in them is water. If we both clean on one end and assume that maybe the person before us didn't clean, then you're going to be having best practices when it comes to safety and not getting the chemical on your clothes or in your eyes. So please be cautious with all measuring utensils. You can rinse them in the pool. It's okay to rinse them in fresh water in the shower, but it's very convenient just to rinse them in the pool after you've added the chemical. Put away all the chemicals and utensils where you found them. Put away all the chemicals and safety equipment. Record the chemical and the amount you added in the log of operations under the daily water balance and chemical checklist. Be sure that you're recording the amounts that you added, not the amounts that should be added. My recommendation is that you never record anything in the log of operations unless it actually occurred or you actually measured it. So if you're determining the amount of chlorine to add to the pool but you haven't added it yet, don't write it in the log of operations until it gets actually added to the pool. If you measure the pH of the pool, then you record that. If you didn't have time yet to measure the pH of the pool, you never ever copy over any information from the previous day or measurement, or even earlier in the day. Whenever you fill out the log of operations, always be sure you're filling out information that you actually measured or you actually added to the pool, or you have direct confirmation from another person that those things have happened. In the following clips, we're going to show you how to locate the timer switches in the pump house. We're going to show you how to, some video clips of how to actually add chemicals by hand so that you can see what that looks like. Also, we're going to go over some scenarios so that you can see step by step how it might look from start to finish after you've taken a chemical reading, looking at the charts, determining the amount you need, then where you acquire or how you add the chemical, start to finish, so that you can see what that looks like in practice.
So if we're coming into the shed here, our timers are right here on the box on the right. Open this baby up. There they are. Here's our chlorine right here and the acid. So let's try a pH test when the pH is a little bit high. Five drops of the 0004. So we're way up there around 7, 8. We're going to do an acid demand test. The acid demand test right here. We're just going to do one drop. It's probably all we're going to need to get it into the acceptable range. So there's our one drop. And that changed us from about 7.8 to about 7.4. So that would be, and you have to check the log of operations charts to make sure you're within the acceptable range. pH, if our pH is above 7.4 or below 7.2, we want to adjust. If the pH was too low, then rather than using the acid demand, we'd use the base demand test. One drop at a time, same thing, until it gets to within the acceptable range. If you had to add one drop on the acid demand test, and you would want to set the acid for 5 minutes, the timer in the pump house. So our acid demand test called for 5 minutes on the timer. Okay, let's see if the chlorine is a little low. We suspect that it is. We've already put our 2 scoops of powder in there. 5, 6, 7. So we're already getting clear here. 7. Let's do maybe one more drop.
8. Yeah.
So that's clear right there. That means we're at 1.6. And we want to be at 2.2. So we're going to have to do the math and add some chlorine. Okay, so we were at 1.6 on the free chlorine, and our target is 2.2. So we need to come up 0.6. We can see right here from our chart that if we want to go up 1 part per million, we need 2.2 cups of bleach. So since we only need 0.6, we're going to need about just maybe a little over half that, about half that. And the target, if we're a little under that, that's okay, because the minimum is 1.6. So if we're at the target or even close to the target, then we're in the ballpark. So when it's close to class and you have to raise the chlorine a certain level, you might not have enough time to use the timer, and then you're going to have to add it by hand. Right now, to get to our target, we need less than a cup at this point, which isn't much. But here we go. Got my gloves and goggles on. Just under a cup, and I'm going to disperse it a little bit if I can here. There we go. And after I'm done with that, I want to wash out my cup. Make sure I don't have any bleach on that, because we don't want to get any bleach on anybody. brain thing.